I fell in love with another man. And we are expecting a baby. My wife said. I took her down. Imagine waking up one day to find that the life you built, your home, your marriage, everything was a lie. My story begins with one shocking confession that changed everything. Stay tuned, because you won't believe how it all ends. And trust me, you won't want to miss this. I sat in my usual chair, the one in the corner of the living room that gave me a clear view of the front door and the hallway leading to the kitchen. It was my favorite spot after a long day at work, just me, my phone, and the comforting glow of the television in the background. I remember scrolling through a few emails, nothing too pressing, just the usual project updates and reports that would wait until tomorrow. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when you've been with someone long enough that words aren't always necessary. I could hear Olivia moving around, probably cleaning up after dinner, or lighting one of those candles she loved so much. Jasmine, that was her favorite scent. Normally, I liked it too. It was calming. But that night, it felt different. It felt heavy. It hung in the air, thick and almost suffocating, like a fog that wouldn't lift. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew. You know that feeling when you can tell a storm's coming, even before the first drop of rain? That's what it felt like. I heard her footsteps getting closer, but I didn't look up right away. I thought maybe she was going to ask if I wanted a drink, or remind me about the trash, something normal. Then, she stopped. She stood right in front of me, not saying anything at first. That's when I finally glanced up. The look on her face wasn't what I expected. She looked calm, too calm. Her expression was distant, like she was bracing herself for something big. That's when she said it. I fell in love with another man, and we're expecting a baby. At first, I thought I misheard her. I actually let out this short laugh, thinking it must be some kind of weird joke. But she wasn't joking. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her face didn't soften. She just stood there, staring down at me, waiting for it to sink in. And it did, all at once. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air right out of me. I blinked a few times, my brain trying to catch up, trying to piece together what she just said. She fell in love with another man? She's pregnant? No, that couldn't be right. This is Olivia, my Olivia, the woman I've shared my life with for years. We built this house together. We painted these walls together. We planned for our future together. She can't be saying this. What? What do you mean? I finally managed to get the words out, but my voice didn't sound like my own. It was shaky, almost desperate. I hoped I had misunderstood. That maybe there was some kind of explanation that would make this make sense. But there wasn't. She just stood there, her arms crossed, as if she'd rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, and was now delivering her final performance. She looked detached, like she was reading off a script, and that hurt more than I could ever put into words. I'm moving in with him, she said, her voice steady. I want you out by the end of the week. It felt like someone had ripped the floor out from under me. I was falling, spinning, unable to find my footing. All I could do was stare at her, trying to find something, anything in her eyes that reminded me of the woman I loved. But all I saw was a stranger who had already made up her mind. The house we built together, the life we built together, it was all meaningless now. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tell her she couldn't just throw it all away. But no words came. I just sat there, feeling my heart break into a million pieces. She kept talking, laying out the logistics of how the separation would work. Movers would be here tomorrow. I could take what I wanted, but the master bedroom had to be cleared. She spoke so matter-of-factly, as if she were giving me a shopping list. And I just sat there, unable to move, unable to respond. I couldn't believe what was happening. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone, the woman I thought I would spend the rest of my life with, was telling me to leave. She was telling me it was over. And the worst part? She didn't even look upset about it. No tears, no anger, just cold, hard certainty. When she finally walked away, the silence in the room was deafening. I stared at the spot where she'd stood, my mind racing. How had I missed this? How did we go from laughing together on the couch to this? My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. The words "I fell in love with another man" played on a loop in my head. Over and over and over. It was like a cruel mantra, one I couldn't escape. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to piece together how my life had just completely fallen apart in a matter of minutes. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Her calm, distant expression. I thought about all the years we'd spent together, every late-night conversation, every shared meal, every inside joke. I thought about the promises we made, the plans we had for the future. It was all gone now. She had decided, she had moved on. And I was left sitting in the ruins of our life, trying to understand how it all fell apart. The sound of the clock ticking was the only thing that kept me grounded. I kept staring at it, watching the minutes pass, hoping that if I stared long enough, time would start moving backward, and I'd wake up to find that this was all some kind of terrible dream. But it wasn't. It was real. It was happening. And I had no idea what to do next. I couldn't process it at first. My body went cold, my mind blank. I was staring at her, trying to understand what she had just said. It didn't feel real. People say your life can change in an instant, but I'd never really believed it. Life was supposed to be gradual. Relationships grew or faded over time. You didn't just wake up one day and find out your wife had fallen in love with someone else. It felt wrong, like the universe had made some kind of mistake. Maybe if I stayed quiet, if I didn't say anything, she'd realize how ridiculous her words sounded and take them back. But she just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to respond, waiting for me to accept what she had done. I kept hearing those words echo in my head. She fell in love with someone else. She's pregnant. I sat there, paralyzed, trying to make sense of it. What do you mean you fell in love with someone else? My voice came out strained, barely above a whisper. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Olivia just looked at me like I was the one who didn't understand. I don't know what else to say, Ryan. It's exactly what it sounds like. I met someone, we fell in love, and now I'm going to have his child. It just happened. I couldn't believe her calmness, her casual tone. It sounded like she was telling me about something as trivial as forgetting to pick up milk at the store. Not something that would completely destroy everything we had built together. My stomach turned as she kept talking, as if she had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, and was now just reading me the lines. We've been growing apart for a while now. You must have seen it. I thought this was the right time to be honest. Honest? The word hit me like a slap. Honesty is something you bring up before everything falls apart. Honesty is admitting you're unhappy so you can fix it. Not blindsiding someone with a bombshell like this after it's too late. My hands were shaking, but I clenched them into fists to try to steady myself. You thought this was the right time? I asked, my voice sharper now. After you've already made your choice? After you've already decided to leave me? She blinked, but her face stayed firm. I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't live a lie anymore. I've been unhappy for a long time. I could feel my anger rising, but it was tangled with confusion, pain, and a desperation to understand how we had gotten here. We've been married for 10 years, Olivia, I said, my voice trembling. 10 years. How can you just throw all that away? How can you look me in the eye and say it like it doesn't matter? She didn't answer right away. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something: regret, guilt, maybe, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. I didn't want it to be this way, she said, her voice softer. I tried, Ryan. I really did. But we've been growing apart for so long, and I didn't know how to tell you. I stood up, unable to sit still anymore. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with every memory we had shared. The nights spent talking about our future. The weekends we spent fixing up the house, building what I thought was a home, not just a structure. The trips, the anniversaries, even the fights, all of it came rushing back at once. How long? I asked, my voice low. How long have you been seeing him? She hesitated, and that pause was all I needed to know the answer wasn't going to make anything better. A few months, she admitted finally. A few months. Those words hit me like a truck. While I was going to work, paying the bills, and thinking we were just going through a rough patch. She was already building a new life with someone else. I felt like a fool. My mind flashed back to all the times I thought something was off. The nights she came home late and brushed it off as working late. The mornings she seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else. It all made sense now, and that realization only made it hurt more. You've been lying to me for months, I said, my voice raw. How could you sit at our table, sleep in our bed, and lie to my face every day. She shook her head, a flicker of frustration breaking through her calm demeanor. I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked into the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe, but the air there was no better. The smell of that jasmine candle was everywhere, filling the space like a cruel reminder of what I thought we had. I gripped the counter, staring at the sink, trying to find some kind of anchor. But there was nothing. Just her words, looping over and over in my head. She fell in love with someone else. She's having his baby. She wants me out of the house I helped build. The house where we celebrated holidays, hosted family dinners, and talked about starting a family of our own. My chest felt like it was caving in. I didn't know if I was angry or heartbroken or both. Maybe I was just numb. I stayed there for what felt like forever, gripping the counter, until I heard her voice from the living room. I'm sorry, Ryan. I never wanted to hurt you. She trailed off, and I could hear her footsteps moving away. I wanted to scream at her, to demand she come back and face me, but I couldn't. I was too drained. My legs felt heavy as I finally walked back into the living room. She wasn't there. She'd gone upstairs. I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. My life had just shattered, and she didn't even look back. I could hear her moving around upstairs, probably packing a bag or making a list of what she wanted me to take when I left. Her calmness made me sick. It felt like she had already moved on, like I was just some unfinished business she needed to clean up before starting her new life. I sat back down in my chair, the one that had always been my safe spot. It didn't feel safe anymore. It felt foreign, like everything in the house suddenly belonged to someone else. The walls that we had painted together seemed to close in on me. The pictures on the mantle, pictures of us on vacations, at parties, smiling and happy, mocked me. All those moments I thought were real. All those memories that now felt like lies. I picked up one of the frames, staring at a photo of us from our 5th anniversary. We were standing on a beach, arms around each other, smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. I remembered how happy I was that day, how sure I was that we would grow old together. Now, looking at that photo, all I could see was the distance in her eyes. A distance I never noticed before. It was like the photo had changed, like the truth had warped it into something unrecognizable. I set the photo down and rubbed my hands over my face, trying to keep myself together. I felt like I was spiraling, like the world was spinning too fast and I couldn't keep up. The house was silent except for the faint creak of the floorboards upstairs. My mind raced with a million questions I couldn't answer. When did she stop loving me? When did I stop being enough? Could I have done something differently? Or was this always going to happen, no matter what I did? The not knowing was the worst part. The lack of closure, the absence of any clear reason why. All I had were her words, spoken so calmly, so coldly. I fell in love with another man. I stayed there, sitting in that chair, long after she'd gone to bed. I couldn't bring myself to go upstairs. I couldn't sleep in the same bed knowing that she had already left me in her heart. The hours crawled by, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. The home we built together. The home that would never feel like mine again. I stared at the ceiling, the dark shadows shifting with the flickering light of the TV, and wondered if I would ever feel whole again. I wondered if the man I was yesterday would ever come back, or if he was gone for good. All I knew in that moment was that I couldn't stop the ache in my chest, the feeling of being completely and utterly lost. Do you think I forgave her after everything she did? Or did I go down a completely different path? Drop a 111 if you think I let it go, or at woo22 FUD if you think I chose revenge. You've got 10 seconds to guess what's your call? The next few days were a blur. I had to leave the house. Not just pack a few things and crash at a friend's place. I had to leave. Olivia had made it clear, she was staying, and I needed to find somewhere else. It felt surreal. This was my home. I'd painted these walls. I'd fixed the broken fence in the backyard. I'd spent hours installing shelves in the garage, and hanging photos in the hallway. I still remembered the weekend we'd planted the roses along the front path. Yet now, as I stood in the living room surrounded by moving boxes, I realized that none of it was mine anymore. She was taking it all. Just like she had taken my trust, my faith in us. I felt like a guest in the one place. I'd always thought of as my refuge. I kept telling myself I had to stay calm, keep my head down, and get through this. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing how broken I was. So I packed. I started in the bedroom, boxing up my clothes, my books, my collection of old vinyl records that I hadn't touched in years, but still couldn't part with. Every item I picked up felt heavy. Not because of its weight, but because of the memories attached to it. That sweater Olivia bought me on our first anniversary. The coffee mug I used every morning. The one she jokingly called my lifeline. Even the stupid stuff, the beat-up baseball cap from a long-forgotten vacation. The worn-out sneakers I'd planned to replace, each piece seemed to remind me of a life I no longer had. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. I'd move from one room to the next, trying to focus on the task at hand, but every step brought back a memory I wasn't ready to face. The living room was the hardest. I kept running into reminders of the life we'd shared. Photos of us smiling, decorations we'd picked out together, the couch where we'd spent countless evenings watching movies. I couldn't bring myself to pack any of it. It was as if touching those things would make it all real. And I wasn't ready for that yet. I was in a daze, numb to everything around me, until I heard the doorbell. It was the moving company. They were early, two guys in blue uniforms, who looked at me with polite indifference, as they started hauling out the boxes. I stood to the side, arms crossed, trying not to let my emotions show. They didn't know who I was or what I was going through. To them, I was just another customer, another job to get done before lunch. I wanted to tell them to stop, to put everything back, to give me more time to figure out what the hell I was doing. But I didn't say a word. I just watched as they carried away my life piece by piece. As they loaded the last box into the truck, Olivia came down the stairs. She didn't say much. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching the scene like it was just another day. Her calmness, her complete lack of emotion, made my blood boil. I had so many questions, so much I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. What was the point? She had made up her mind. She'd already moved on in her heart. This was just the final step. When the movers left, I looked around the house one last time. It was empty now, stripped of everything that had made it ours. The walls were bare, the rooms echoed with every step, and the air felt colder somehow. It was no longer a home, it was just a house. I stood in the doorway, staring at the spot where our family photos had hung, the place where the couch used to sit. I could almost hear the laughter, the conversations we'd had, the promises we'd made. But they were just ghosts now. I didn't know if I could ever come back here again. I didn't know if I'd even want to. With a heavy heart, I stepped outside. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of kids playing and lawnmowers humming in the distance. It felt wrong, as if the world should have stopped spinning, just for a moment, to acknowledge what I'd lost. But it didn't. Life went on. I walked to my car, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, staring at the house, trying to convince myself that it was just a building, that I didn't need it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about the bricks and mortar. It was about what it represented, everything I'd worked for, everything I thought I had. And now it was gone. When I finally started the car and drove away, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I needed to focus on what came next, even if I didn't have a clue what that was. I felt like I was leaving behind not just a house, but a piece of myself. The person I had been in that house, the man who had believed in love, who had built a life with someone he thought would be by his side forever, that person was gone. I didn't know who I was anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. I had to keep moving, even if I didn't know where I was going. I drove aimlessly for a while. The hum of the tires on the asphalt, the only sound in the car. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Emails. Texts from friends who had no idea what had happened. Calendar reminders that felt meaningless now. I ignored them all. The radio was off, and the silence was oppressive, filled only by my own thoughts. Over and over, I heard her words, "I fell in love with another man." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road ahead. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't leave that sentence behind. It chased me like a shadow, growing darker and heavier with each passing mile. I kept thinking back to the months before all of this. Was she really unhappy that long? And how did I not see it? I thought we were fine. Sure, things had been quiet, maybe less affectionate than when we first got married. But who doesn't go through that after a decade together? I figured it was just life, jobs, stress, the usual wear and tear. But now, every memory felt different. The nights she came home late from work. The times she seemed distracted during dinner. Even the weekends when she chose to visit friends instead of spending time with me. I thought I'd been giving her space, being understanding. I thought that's what a good husband did. But looking back now, it felt like I'd been blind. All those moments I brushed off were red flags, and I'd missed every single one of them. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my fault. I couldn't control her feelings. I couldn't change what had already happened. But no matter how hard I tried, that thought lingered in the back of my mind. Maybe I could have done more. Maybe if I'd said something, if I'd pushed harder, we wouldn't have ended up here. I shook my head, as if I could physically dislodge those doubts. What was the point in thinking like that? She made her choice. She chose him. And now I had to deal with the fallout. The anger came in waves. One moment, I'd feel completely numb, like my body was on autopilot. The next, I'd be gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. My jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. How could she do this to me? After everything we'd been through, after everything I'd done for her, how could she just throw it all away? I'd been faithful, supportive. I'd worked long hours, not because I didn't want to be with her, but because I wanted to provide for us. I thought I was doing the right thing. But apparently, none of that mattered. She wanted someone else. And she didn't just leave me, she told me she was pregnant with his child. That was the part that cut the deepest. It wasn't just that she'd replaced me. She was starting a family with him. Something we had talked about doing together for years. I could barely breathe when I thought about it. It felt like she'd ripped the future right out from under me and handed it to someone else. I pulled into a gas station, more out of habit than necessity. I got out of the car, the cool evening air hitting me like a slap in the face. The gas pump beeped as I set it to fill, and I leaned against the car, staring off into the distance. The lights from the convenience store cast a harsh glow on the pavement. A few other cars came and went, their drivers paying no attention to me. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter. And maybe I didn't. Maybe I never had. I shook my head again, trying to push that thought away. It wasn't helpful, it wasn't fair to me, to anyone. But the doubts kept creeping in, no matter how much I fought them. After filling up the tank, I went inside to grab a drink. The cashier barely looked at me as I paid, which was fine. I didn't want to talk to anyone anyway. I just wanted to keep moving, to keep driving until I didn't feel anything anymore. But as I got back in the car and opened the bottle, I realized that wasn't going to happen. No amount of distance was going to erase what had happened. I couldn't run from it. I had to face it. I just didn't know how. The drive back to my temporary apartment felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes. By the time I got there, it was dark. I parked in the small lot and stared at the building. It wasn't much, just a small, one-bedroom place I'd found on short notice. The rent was cheap, the neighbors kept to themselves, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the guy next door watching late-night TV. It was a far cry from the house Olivia and I had shared. That house had felt alive, full of memories and plans for the future. This place felt like a waiting room, a stopgap. I couldn't imagine building a life here. I couldn't imagine anything beyond just surviving the next day. I walked up the stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air was stale, the walls bare. A single lamp cast a dim light across the room, illuminating the boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack yet. I didn't have the energy. What was the point? It wasn't like I had anyone to impress. I sat down on the couch and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was joined by exhaustion. I felt like I'd aged 10 years in the span of a week. The events of the past few days replayed in my mind like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. The moment she told me. The way she looked at me, so calm and detached. The movers carrying out the last of my belongings. Driving away from the house. It was all on a loop, each memory more painful than the last. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It didn't help. The anger kept bubbling up, demanding attention. I wanted to yell, to punch something, to do anything to release the pressure building inside me. But what would that solve? It wouldn't change what she did. It wouldn't bring back the life we had. It wouldn't make me feel any better. I rubbed my hands over my face and let out a long sigh. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to move forward. All I knew was that the man I used to be, the man who believed in love, who trusted his wife, who thought he had a solid future, was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize. Someone who was angry, bitter, and completely lost. I didn't know how to find my way back, or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going like this. But for now, all I could do was sit there, staring at the walls of my new, empty apartment, and wonder how the hell my life had come to this. It started with something small, an email from the HR department that landed in my inbox one morning. They wanted me to confirm my address for a benefits update. I almost ignored it, the way you do when you think everything is in order. But something made me pause. I realized I hadn't updated my address since I moved out of the house. A small detail, but it hit me like a hammer. I wasn't just dealing with emotional fallout. There were practical things to handle, and every one of them brought me back to the same truth. Nothing about my life was the same anymore. I sat there staring at my computer screen, the office around me buzzing with activity. Phones ringing, people talking, someone laughing at a joke in the break room. It all felt so distant, like I was in a soundproof booth, watching the world continue on without me. I closed the email without replying, and tried to focus on the project in front of me, but my concentration was shot. The numbers blurred together. I kept seeing her face, hearing her voice in my head. I fell in love with another man. Over and over. It was like a loop that wouldn't stop. I clenched my fists under the desk and forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. I couldn't break down here. Not at work. I told myself I just needed to make it through the day. One task at a time. One meeting, one report, and then I could go home and what? Sit in that empty apartment, staring at the walls again, reliving everything I'd lost. The thought made my stomach churn. By lunch, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat, mumbled something about running an errand, and left. The crisp air outside was a relief, even if it didn't quiet the noise in my head. I walked aimlessly, hands shoved deep in my pockets, dodging clusters of people on the sidewalk. It felt like everyone else had somewhere to be, something important to do, while I was just drifting. I ended up at a park a few blocks away. There was a bench near the fountain, and I sat down, watching the water spray into the air, catching the sunlight. It should have been soothing, but it wasn't. My mind was still racing. I started pulling out my phone without even thinking. It was a reflex, looking for some kind of distraction. But as I scrolled through messages and social media, it only made things worse. Happy couples, friends on vacations, people posting about promotions or new homes. It all felt like a reminder of what I didn't have anymore. I locked the screen and shoved the phone back into my pocket. That's when I noticed a man sitting a few benches down, an older guy with a worn-out jacket and a wool cap. He was reading a newspaper, the kind you hardly see anymore, flipping the pages slowly. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't look sad either. Just calm, at peace. I wondered how he did it. How do you get to a place where you can just sit there, in the middle of the chaos, and not feel like your world is falling apart? My thoughts drifted to Olivia again. I couldn't stop replaying our last conversation. The way she looked at me when she told me it was over. She hadn't seemed angry or hurt. She hadn't even seemed sad. That's what got to me. She was so calm, so certain, like she'd been planning it for weeks or months, and I was the last to know. I still didn't understand how she could do it so easily. How she could stand there and tell me she was leaving, that she was having someone else's child, and not shed a single tear. Meanwhile, I felt like I was falling apart, like every part of me was being ripped to pieces and scattered in the wind. I rubbed my face, trying to push the image of her out of my mind, but the harder I tried, the more it lingered. The way she said, "I'm sorry, Ryan," in that flat matter-of-fact tone. The way she told me it was best for both of us. How could she think this was what's best for me? How could she believe that walking away from everything we had built, everything we had promised each other, was somehow good for me? It made no sense. I wanted answers, but I didn't even know what questions to ask. And even if I did, what difference would it make? She'd already made up her mind. She wasn't coming back. A group of kids ran past me, laughing as they chased each other around the fountain. Their laughter was loud, echoing off the nearby buildings, and for a moment I envied them. They didn't have to worry about heartbreak or betrayal or starting over. They didn't have to think about how to rebuild their lives after everything they thought was stable turned to dust. I watched them for a while, their carefree energy both comforting and painful. I wanted to feel that way again, to be free of all this anger and sadness, to just exist in the moment. But I didn't know how. Eventually, I stood up, stuffed my hands back in my pockets, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going, but at least I was moving. Each step felt like a tiny victory, like I was proving to myself that I could keep going, even if I didn't have a clear destination. The city noise buzzed around me, horns honking, voices calling out, the distant rumble of a train. It was all a blur, background noise to the storm in my head. I just kept walking, hoping that somewhere along the way, I'd find something, anything that would help me make sense of it all. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind stuck in a cycle I couldn't break. The city was alive around me, cars honking, people rushing past, the hum of conversation spilling out of cafes and restaurants. It all felt so distant, like I was watching it happen through a pane of glass. I had nowhere to go, nowhere that felt like home, so I just kept moving. The cool air stung my face, and the ache in my legs reminded me that I was still alive, still grounded in the physical world, even if my thoughts felt like they were floating somewhere I couldn't reach. I turned down a quiet side street, the noise fading behind me, and stopped at a small park bench under a street lamp. I sat down and let out a long breath. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I didn't know who I was. All I knew was that I couldn't go back, not to the life I had, not to the man I was before everything fell apart. As I sat there, I couldn't help but replay it all in my head. Her calm, measured tone, her detached expression, the way she told me she was pregnant with another man's child like she was discussing the weather. I hated that I still saw her face every time I closed my eyes. I hated that no matter how far I walked, I couldn't leave it behind. It wasn't just the betrayal that got to me. It was the way she did it. So cold. So final. I'd spent so much time trying to make things work, convincing myself that we were just in a rough patch. I thought if I gave her space, if I stayed patient, we'd find our way back to each other. I thought we were on the same team. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. The park was empty. Just the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of traffic. I leaned back and stared up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible against the city lights, but they were there. I used to love looking at the stars. Olivia and I used to sit in the backyard, a bottle of wine between us, talking about everything and nothing. I used to think those were the moments that mattered most, the ones that built a life together. Now, it felt like I'd imagined all of it, like it never really happened. She clearly didn't hold on to those memories the way I did. If she did, she wouldn't have left so easily. She wouldn't have shattered everything we built without a second thought. I felt my hands clenching into fists on my lap. I didn't want to feel this way anymore. I didn't want to be angry, but I couldn't stop it. The anger was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. If I let go of that, all I'd have left was the sadness, and I wasn't sure I could handle that. I wasn't sure I could sit here and really feel how much I'd lost. How much of myself was wrapped up in her, in our life together. I didn't know who I was without her. That scared me more than anything. I used to be confident. I used to feel like I had a solid foundation under my feet. Now I felt like I was stumbling in the dark, hoping to find something to hold on to. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. A jogger passed by, her sneakers crunching against the gravel path. She didn't look at me, didn't even notice I was there. I envied her for that, for having a routine, a purpose. Something to focus on other than the mess inside her own head. I thought about getting up and walking again, but I didn't have the energy. I just sat there, staring at the ground, trying to figure out how I'd let things get so bad, how I hadn't seen it coming. I knew that blaming myself wouldn't help, but it was easier than accepting that Olivia had made a choice that had nothing to do with me. A choice I couldn't change. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour. Maybe more. The cold started to seep in, and I knew I couldn't stay much longer. I finally stood up and started walking back toward the apartment. It wasn't home, but it was all I had. As I walked, I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the rhythm of my steps, the sound of my breathing. It didn't work. The anger, the confusion, the sadness, they were all still there, bubbling just under the surface. I kept thinking about what I'd do next, how I'd move forward, but I had no answers. I didn't even know where to start. I just kept moving, hoping that somehow, eventually, the pieces would fall into place. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at the screen as her words burned into my mind. The text was short, just a few sentences, but it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing into my chest. She wasn't just leaving me, she was cutting me off completely. She made it clear, she wanted nothing to do with me anymore. It wasn't enough that she had moved in with him. It wasn't enough that she was having his child. No, now she was erasing me from her life entirely, like I had never mattered. Like the years we'd spent together were nothing more than a bad memory she was trying to forget. I felt the rage rise up again, hotter than ever. My hand tightened around the phone, and for a moment, I thought about throwing it against the wall. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I replayed our last conversation over and over in my head, searching for anything that would make sense of it all. Had I missed the signs? Was there some moment when I could have done something differently? Said something differently? I kept telling myself it wasn't my fault, that she had made her own choices. But the doubt wouldn't go away. I couldn't help wondering if I'd driven her into his arms. Maybe I worked too much. Maybe I didn't show her how much I loved her. Maybe I took her for granted. The what-ifs swirled in my head, and I couldn't stop them. I hated myself for feeling this way, for questioning everything, for letting her words rip me apart all over again. She didn't care how I felt. She never even asked, she just left. She made her decision, and now I was the one left picking up the pieces. I put the phone down and walked into the kitchen, but even that small act felt meaningless. I wasn't hungry, but I opened the fridge anyway. The sight of the neatly stacked leftovers only made me angrier. This used to be our routine. She'd cook, I'd clean up, we'd joke about who made the best meals. Now it was just me. Everything in that fridge was mine, and it felt so empty. I slammed the door shut and leaned against the counter, gripping the edge so hard. My knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to do anything to release the pressure building inside me. But I didn't. I just stood there, breathing hard, my head spinning. I thought about calling someone, my brother, maybe, or Jason, but what was the point? They'd just tell me to move on, to forget about her. As if it were that simple. As if I could just snap my fingers and stop loving her. I wanted to stop. I wanted to erase her from my mind the way she had erased me from hers. But I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I heard her laugh. I felt her hand in mine. I hated her for what she did, but I hated myself even more for still loving her. It was a cruel joke, and I was the punchline. I started pacing the small kitchen, my thoughts spiraling. The anger was boiling over now, and I couldn't hold it back. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a glass, and hurled it against the wall. The sound of it shattering was loud, sharp, almost satisfying. I stared at the broken pieces on the floor, my chest heaving, my hands shaking. For a moment, I felt like I'd regained control. But the feeling didn't last. The silence returned, heavier than before. The glass was just a glass. Breaking it hadn't changed anything. It hadn't brought her back. It hadn't made the pain go away. It hadn't fixed me. I sank down onto the floor, my back against the cabinets, and buried my face in my hands. I felt like I was drowning. The room spun around me, and the weight of everything came crashing down all at once. She was gone. She was never coming back. And I didn't know how to live without her. I didn't know who I was without her. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the floor, my mind a chaotic mess. The anger, the pain, the confusion, it all blended together until I couldn't tell one from the other. I just felt empty. And I hated it. I don't know what finally made me get up. Maybe it was the cold tile under me, or the fact that the silence was driving me insane. I stood up, grabbed a broom, and started sweeping up the broken glass. It was a small, mechanical action, but it gave me something to focus on. I didn't think about her as I cleaned. I didn't think about him. I just focused on the pieces, on getting them all off the floor so I wouldn't step on them later. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was all I had. When I was done, I poured myself a drink, not water, not juice. Something stronger. Something that would help me forget, if only for a little while. I sat down on the couch, glass in hand, and stared at the dark TV screen. The room was quiet again, but it didn't feel as heavy. I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through me. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a band-aid. But it was better than nothing. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for the first time in days, I let myself breathe. It wasn't peace, not really, but it was a start. I woke up the next morning with the faint taste of whiskey still lingering on my tongue. The sunlight was spilling through the blinds, cutting sharp angles across the floor. And the dull ache in my head reminded me that I hadn't exactly stopped at one drink the night before. I rubbed my temples, trying to will away the fog, and dragged myself off the couch. The room was as lifeless as it had been the night before. No new answers. No sudden clarity. Just me, standing there, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I shuffled into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee. The rich, bitter aroma doing little to settle the storm inside me. As the liquid warmed my throat, I looked around the small apartment, at the boxes I still hadn't unpacked. The blank walls, the empty shelves. It didn't feel like mine. It didn't feel like home. It felt temporary, like a holding cell. A place where I was serving out some sentence. I didn't fully understand. And yet, this was my reality. I had to accept that. I picked up my phone from the counter, still hesitant to even turn it on. When I finally did, the screen lit up with messages. Friends checking in, coworkers asking about a project, a reminder about a dentist appointment I had forgotten to cancel. None of it mattered. None of it felt real. I ignored the notifications and opened the weather app instead, as if knowing it was 68 degrees and sunny would somehow make me feel less lost. It didn't. A few sips later, I threw on a hoodie and decided to go out. I couldn't sit in that apartment another minute. I grabbed my keys and walked down the creaky stairs, the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the walls. Outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying just a hint of fall. I jammed my hands into my pockets and started walking. No destination in mind. Just moving for the sake of movement. The streets were coming to life. People heading to work. Kids waiting at bus stops. Delivery drivers, unloading crates of produce outside a grocery store. I passed them all like a ghost. Present but invisible. The sounds of the city swirled around me. A cacophony of car engines, distant sirens. Snippets of conversation. It was overwhelming and strangely comforting all at once. I wasn't alone, not really. But I was. I knew that. It didn't matter how many people were around me, I was still carrying this weight. Still trying to figure out how to keep going. I turned a corner and found myself on a quieter street. Small brownstones lined the sidewalk, their stoops decorated with potted plants and faded welcome mats. I slowed my pace, my breath fogging slightly in the cool air. There was a bench up ahead, tucked under a tree that still had most of its leaves. I sat down and stared at the pavement. The anger that had gripped me last night was still there, bubbling just beneath the surface. But now, it was mixed with something else, something I didn't want to name. Something that felt too much like sorrow. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But life never is it? I took out my phone and opened my email, scanning through the subject lines without really seeing them. I opened one from HR, something about updating my personal information. I read the words, but they didn't register. I closed it, scrolling aimlessly through other messages until I came across one from a name I didn't recognize. My thumb hovered over it, hesitation creeping in. Finally, I opened it. It was just a spam email, some junk about refinancing my student loans. I deleted it, and let out a bitter laugh. Of course it was nothing. That's all it ever was lately, nothing. I leaned back on the bench, feeling the cold wood against my shoulders, and looked up at the branches above me. The leaves shifted gently in the breeze, some of them falling to the ground. I watched one as it drifted down, spinning lazily before landing on the sidewalk. I wished I could feel that light. I wished I could just let go, float down, and land softly. But I couldn't. I was too heavy, weighed down by everything that had happened. I felt stuck, like I was running in place, getting nowhere. It was a feeling I couldn't escape, no matter how far I walked, no matter how many drinks I had, no matter how much I tried to distract myself. I sat there for a long time, not thinking, not moving, just watching the world pass by. A woman walked by with a stroller, her baby's laughter ringing out like a melody. A man in a business suit talked loudly on his phone, gesturing with one hand as he walked briskly down the street. A jogger passed, her footsteps a steady rhythm on the pavement. They all had places to be. They all had purpose. I envied them. I envied their normalcy, their sense of direction. I wanted to feel that again. I wanted to feel like my life wasn't just a series of broken pieces I couldn't fit back together. Eventually, I stood up and started walking again. The day stretched out in front of me, long and uncertain. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay still. I had to keep moving, even if I wasn't sure what I was moving toward. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't go back, not to the apartment, not to the person I was before. I had to find something new, something that made sense. I just didn't know how. The days that followed weren't easier, just quieter. I still walked the same streets, still passed the same faces, but the weight I carried was no longer the sharp, searing pain it had been. It dulled. I dulled. I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point, I realized I was no longer living in the moment she left. I was still angry, still hurt, but it didn't consume me the way it once had. It became a part of me, like a scar that would always be there, but one that no longer stung when I touched it. And that's when I knew I had started to move forward. One morning, I stood in my small kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window, the faint hum of traffic outside. I made coffee like I always did, the familiar routine giving me a sense of control, however small. As the rich, bitter aroma filled the air, I leaned against the counter, cup in hand, and let my mind wander. For once, it didn't drift back to her. Instead, I thought about where I was physically, emotionally, and what I wanted to do next. I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew I couldn't stay stuck in the same cycle. I needed something new, something that was mine. A fresh start. It began with small steps. I signed up for a running group. Nothing serious. Just a few people meeting in the park a couple of mornings each week. I hadn't run in years, not since before everything fell apart. At first, it was brutal. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and I could barely keep up with the rest of the group. But I kept showing up. Each time, it got a little easier. I found myself looking forward to those runs, not just for the exercise, but for the sense of community. It was good to be around people again, to have simple, positive interactions that weren't weighed down by the past. From there, I started saying yes more often. A coworker invited me to a weekend hike, and instead of making up an excuse, I went. A neighbor suggested grabbing a beer at the local pub, and I joined him. These weren't major events, but they felt significant to me. Each outing, each new experience, chipped away at the walls I'd built around myself. I started to remember what it felt like to enjoy the world, to laugh without bitterness, to have conversations that didn't revolve around what I had lost. Slowly, I was beginning to see a version of myself I had almost forgotten, a version that could move on. One night, after a long day at work, I sat on my couch, laptop open, searching for something to watch. Instead of the usual mindless sitcom or action movie, I clicked on a documentary about rebuilding after disaster. It wasn't a direct parallel to my situation. This was about people recovering from natural disasters. Not personal heartbreak, but something about their resilience resonated with me. These were people who had lost everything: homes, businesses, entire communities, and yet they found ways to rebuild. They didn't erase the past. They didn't pretend it hadn't happened. They simply accepted it and used it as a foundation for something new. I watched, transfixed, and when it ended, I felt a small, steady flame of hope. If they could find a way forward, so could I. That night, I pulled out a notebook I hadn't used in years. I used to jot down thoughts, ideas, little goals, nothing too serious. But somewhere along the way, I stopped. I guess I didn't see the point anymore. Now, though, I felt compelled to write. I didn't have a grand plan or a clear vision. I just started making a list. Not of what I had lost, but of what I wanted to gain. The first item was simple: run a 5K. The second was just as straightforward: try a new recipe every week. Then came reconnect with an old friend, take a weekend trip, and read a book that has nothing to do with work. None of these things would fix me overnight, but that wasn't the point. The point was to keep moving, to keep finding reasons to get up in the morning. To keep pushing forward even when it felt like the past was dragging me back. In the weeks that followed, I crossed a few things off that list. I ran a 5K not fast, not gracefully, but I finished it. I dusted off my old copy of a cookbook my mom had given me years ago, and made a dish I'd never tried before. I called an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in years, and we ended up talking for hours, laughing about the stupid things we did back then. It felt good. It felt real. It reminded me that life wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about finding the moments of calm after. The moments that made it all worth it. Of course, not every day was easy. There were still nights when I found myself staring at the ceiling, the silence of the apartment pressing down on me. There were still moments when I felt the pang of what I'd lost. When her voice echoed in my head. When I wondered if I'd ever fully heal. But those moments didn't define me anymore. They were just part of the journey, reminders that healing isn't linear. It's messy, it's slow, and it's often painful. But it's also worth it. As time went on, I started to feel lighter. I noticed the change not in big, dramatic moments, but in the small, subtle shifts. I smiled more. I slept better. I stopped flinching every time I heard her name. I even started thinking about the future not with fear or sadness, but with curiosity and hope. I didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to see what life had in store for me. I was ready to keep going, to keep building, to keep living. One afternoon, as I sat in the park after a run, I watched the leaves falling from the trees, the crisp breeze carrying them gently to the ground. I realized I hadn't thought about her once that day. Not once. I'd been too busy living talking to the other runners, joking about who was the slowest, planning the next outing. The realization hit me with a mix of surprise and relief. I wasn't over everything, not completely, but I was no longer stuck in the moment she left. I had stepped out of that shadow and into something new. As the sun set and the sky turned a warm orange, I took a deep breath and smiled. The road ahead wasn't clear, and I knew there would still be challenges. But I also knew that I was strong enough to face them. I wasn't the same person I was before. I'd been through the fire, and though it had left its mark, it hadn't destroyed me. It had shaped me into someone who could keep moving forward. Someone who could find peace in the small moments. Someone who could look at the horizon and see a future worth walking toward. The shocking truth left me speechless, but I took control of my story. What would you do in my situation? Would you rise above it? Or take justice into your own hands? Don't forget to like, comment, and share. Let's hear what you would have done. Life isn't always fair, and heartbreak can feel like a personal tragedy, but I've learned that we don't have to let it define us. What matters most is how we pick ourselves up, how we find new purpose and keep moving forward. I now understand that even the most painful experiences can teach us resilience and push us toward growth. We all face challenges, different sizes, different shapes, but we're stronger than we think. The key is to never give up, to always believe in the possibility of a better tomorrow. It's that quiet determination that shapes a stronger, more compassionate society.